The sound of raised voices and growing crowds outside the office made it clear that the situation was rapidly spiraling beyond anything that could be contained through quiet conversation and careful planning. Marcus looked at Victoria, who was staring out the small window with obvious anxiety as more people gathered in the castle's entrance area. "This is getting out of hand," Victoria said quietly. "Those bloggers are turning my moment of poor behavior into some kind of public spectacle." Marcus moved to the window to assess the situation himself. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about how quickly social media incidents could escalate. At least 30 people were now gathered outside, with several individuals holding phones and cameras while interviewing tourists and attempting to get castle staff to provide statements. Sarah returned to the office with a grim expression. "I've spoken with our media relations team. They're sending someone immediately, but it will take at least 20 minutes for them to arrive. In the meantime, we need to manage this situation carefully to prevent it from getting worse." "How much worse can it get?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Social media incidents can escalate very quickly," Sarah explained. "If the narrative becomes established before we can provide context, it can become very difficult to correct misunderstandings or provide balanced information." Marcus realized that his military experience with information warfare and crowd control might be relevant to their current situation. "What kind of narrative are the bloggers trying to establish?" "From what our staff observed, they're framing this as another example of entitled behavior at royal sites," Sarah replied. "They're particularly interested in the class dynamics and what they're calling aristocratic attitudes toward public servants." Victoria winced. "That's not entirely inaccurate, given how I behaved initially. But it completely misses the context of my charitable work and the constructive conversation we've had since then." "Context is often the first casualty in social media coverage," Marcus observed. "People are more interested in simple narratives that confirm their existing opinions than in complex stories that require careful consideration." The situation was complicated by the fact that Victoria's initial behavior had indeed been problematic, making it difficult to defend her actions without appearing to excuse inappropriate conduct. However, her subsequent willingness to learn and refocus on constructive charitable work demonstrated personal growth that deserved recognition. James appeared at the door again, this time looking genuinely concerned. "The crowd is getting larger, and some people are becoming quite vocal in their opinions. A few tourists are complaining that they can't complete their planned visits because of the disruption." This information highlighted another dimension of the problem. The media attention was now affecting other visitors' experiences, creating exactly the kind of operational disruption that castle security was designed to prevent. "We need to find a way to address this situation that serves everyone's interests," Marcus said, drawing on his experience with complex military operations that required balancing multiple objectives. Victoria stood up with sudden determination. "I caused this problem, and I should be the one to fix it. Maybe if I speak to the bloggers and take full responsibility, I can prevent the situation from getting worse." Sarah shook her head firmly. Untrained individuals making spontaneous media statements often make situations much worse. These bloggers aren't interested in balanced coverage or constructive resolutions. They want content that will generate views and engagement. "Then, what do you suggest?" Victoria asked, her frustration evident. "I can't just hide in here while other people deal with the consequences of my behavior." Marcus found himself thinking about the leadership challenges he had faced in Afghanistan, where complex situations required decisions that balanced immediate tactical needs with longer-term strategic objectives. The current situation had similar dynamics, requiring them to address both immediate crowd management and longer-term reputation concerns. "What if we approach this as an opportunity for education rather than damage control?" he suggested. "Instead of just defending against negative coverage, we could try to redirect attention toward the charitable work that brought you here in the first place." Victoria looked intrigued. "What do you mean?" "You came here with genuine intentions to support veterans organizations," Marcus explained. "That's a positive story that people might be interested in hearing. The fact that your initial approach was wrong doesn't negate the value of your charitable goals." Sarah considered this suggestion carefully. "It's an interesting approach, but it would require very careful execution to avoid appearing to excuse the inappropriate behavior while highlighting the constructive outcomes. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Patricia Williams, the castle's senior media relations officer. She was a composed woman in her 50s who had handled numerous high-profile incidents involving royal sites and social media coverage. "I understand we have a situation that's attracting blogger attention," Patricia said without preamble. "Can someone brief me quickly on what happened and where we stand now?" Sarah provided a concise summary of the morning's events, from Victoria's initial confrontation through the constructive conversation about charitable work to the current media attention. Patricia listened without comment, taking occasional notes on a small tablet. "Ms. Pemberton Hayes," Patricia said when Sarah finished, "I understand you're willing to take responsibility for your initial behavior. That's commendable, but we need to think strategically about how to handle this situation in a way that serves everyone's best interests." Victoria nodded eagerly. "I want to do whatever is most helpful. I don't want my mistakes to create ongoing problems for the castle staff or damage the reputation of the veterans organizations I work with." Patricia turned to Marcus. "Sergeant Thompson, I understand you intervened to help resolve the initial situation. That was professional and appropriate, but it also means you're now a central figure in whatever narrative emerges." Marcus nodded, aware that his career could be significantly affected by how this situation was handled. "I'm prepared to follow whatever guidance you think is most appropriate for protecting the castle's reputation and operational effectiveness." "The challenge," Patricia explained, "is that simple damage control often doesn't work with social media incidents. People can sense when they're getting sanitized corporate responses, and that often makes them more suspicious and critical." "What's the alternative?" Sarah asked. "Authentic engagement that acknowledges problems while highlighting positive outcomes," Patricia replied. "If we can demonstrate that this incident led to constructive education and better understanding, it becomes a different kind of story." Victoria's face brightened. "You mean we could focus on how my mistake led to learning about proper procedures and more effective ways to support veterans organizations?" "Exactly," Patricia confirmed. "People respond well to stories about personal growth and learning from mistakes, especially when those stories lead to positive outcomes for worthy causes." Marcus found himself impressed by the strategic thinking behind this approach. Instead of trying to deny or minimize the problem, they would acknowledge it while demonstrating how it had been transformed into something constructive. "What would this approach require from each of us?" he asked. Patricia consulted her tablet. "It would require coordinated statements that acknowledge the initial problems, explain the learning that occurred, and highlight the positive outcomes. Most importantly, it would require authenticity. People can detect scripted responses, and that would undermine the entire approach." "I can certainly speak authentically about what I learned," Victoria said. "This morning has been genuinely educational for me, and I do want to redirect my charitable efforts in more effective directions. And I can speak to how professional protocols are designed to serve constructive purposes, even when visitors initially find them frustrating," Marcus added. Patricia nodded approvingly. "Those are exactly the kinds of authentic perspectives that could transform this from a negative incident into something genuinely educational for everyone involved." The plan they developed over the next few minutes was more sophisticated than Marcus had expected. Instead of simple damage control, they would attempt to use the media attention as an opportunity to educate people about proper procedures for special requests at royal sites, the reality of charitable event planning, and the importance of supporting veterans organizations through effective rather than symbolic approaches. Victoria would acknowledge her initial behavior as inappropriate while explaining her genuine charitable motivations. Marcus would discuss how security protocols serve important purposes while remaining flexible enough to accommodate legitimate needs when properly presented. Sarah would explain how visitor services work to balance accessibility with operational requirements. "The key," Patricia emphasized, "is that we're not asking people to excuse bad behavior. We're demonstrating how bad behavior can be transformed into learning opportunities that lead to positive outcomes." As they prepared to implement this strategy, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his morning had evolved. What had begun as routine ceremonial duty had become an exercise in crisis management, educational outreach, and community relations that would likely affect how he thought about his role for years to come. The group emerged from the office to find that the crowd had indeed grown substantially. However, Patricia's team had arranged for a structured approach that would allow them to provide information without creating a chaotic press conference atmosphere. Victoria's statement was brief but heartfelt. She acknowledged that her initial behavior had been inappropriate and explained how the conversation with castle staff had helped her understand both proper procedures and more effective approaches to charitable work. She specifically thanked Marcus and Sarah for their professionalism and patience in turning a negative situation into a learning experience. Marcus spoke about how security protocols at royal sites are designed to ensure everyone's safety while remaining responsive to legitimate needs when those needs are properly communicated through appropriate channels. He emphasized that his role as a royal guard included helping visitors understand these procedures rather than simply enforcing them rigidly. Sarah explained how visitor services work to accommodate special circumstances while maintaining operational consistency and security requirements. She provided information about legitimate channels for special requests and educational partnerships that could serve charitable purposes. The bloggers who had initially hoped for a simple scandal story found themselves with something more complex and potentially more interesting. The narrative of personal growth, professional education, and constructive problem-solving didn't fit the standard templates for social media outrage, but it offered genuine educational value that could serve broader public interests. Over the following hours, as clips from their statements began circulating online, the response was notably different from what everyone had anticipated. While some people remained critical of Victoria's initial behavior, many others expressed appreciation for her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and learn from them. Marcus received messages from fellow service members who appreciated his articulation of how security protocols serve legitimate purposes while remaining responsive to reasonable needs. Several veterans organizations reached out to Victoria with information about effective fundraising approaches and offers to collaborate on educational initiatives. The incident that had begun as a potential crisis evolved into something genuinely constructive for everyone involved. Victoria's charitable efforts became more effective and better informed. Marcus gained experience in public communication that enhanced his ability to serve in his role as a royal guard. Sarah and the visitor services team received positive recognition for their professionalism in handling difficult situations. 6 months later, Victoria's Veterans Charity had successfully organized several educational events that raised both awareness and funds for veterans organizations. These events incorporated the lessons she had learned about proper procedures and effective communication, making them more successful than her original castle-focused plan might have been. Marcus was promoted to senior guard with additional responsibilities that included training other guards in visitor relations and crisis management. His experience in transforming a confrontational situation into an educational opportunity became a case study in professional development programs. The castle's visitor services implemented new training protocols based on the lessons learned from the incident, focusing on how to recognize and redirect inappropriate behavior while identifying and supporting legitimate charitable and educational interests. The social media coverage of the incident became a frequently cited example of how negative situations can be transformed into positive outcomes when all parties approach problems with authenticity, professionalism, and willingness to learn from mistakes. Patricia Williams used the incident as a template for media relations training, demonstrating how strategic thinking about narrative development can transform potential public relations disasters into opportunities for positive community engagement. The bloggers who had originally hoped for a simple scandal story found that their more nuanced coverage received more engagement and positive feedback than their usual content, leading several of them to explore more constructive approaches to social media journalism. The tourists who witnessed the original confrontation and its resolution reported that their castle visit had been more educational and memorable than they had expected, with several mentioning that seeing professional problem-solving in action had enhanced their appreciation for both the castle staff's expertise and the importance of proper procedures at historic sites. The incident became a teaching example used in customer service training programs across multiple industries, demonstrating how patient professionalism and strategic thinking can transform difficult customer interactions into opportunities for education and positive outcomes. Victoria's work with veterans organizations continued to expand, incorporating the communication skills and procedural understanding she had gained from her experience at Windsor Castle. Her fundraising events became known for their educational value and authentic focus on addressing real veterans' needs rather than simply generating social recognition for donors. Marcus continued his service as a royal guard with enhanced appreciation for how his role extended beyond security and ceremony to include community education and public relations. His experience demonstrated how individual professional development could serve broader institutional goals and community interests. The lasting impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate participants, influencing how multiple organizations approached customer relations, crisis management, and community engagement. What had begun as a moment of inappropriate behavior became a catalyst for positive change that benefited numerous people and organizations over the following years. The story became a reminder that even negative incidents can produce positive outcomes when all parties involved approach problems with authenticity, professionalism, and commitment to learning from mistakes rather than simply assigning blame or avoiding responsibility. In the end, everyone involved agreed that while Victoria's initial behavior had been inappropriate and disruptive, the incident had ultimately served constructive purposes that justified the initial discomfort and inconvenience. The transformation of a potential crisis into an opportunity for education and growth became a model for how similar situations could be handled in the future. Marcus Thompson had been standing guard at Windsor Castle's public entrance for 3 years, but he had never encountered anything quite like what happened on that rainy Tuesday morning in October. The 28-year-old former military sergeant wore his ceremonial red tunic with pride, his black bearskin hat perfectly positioned despite the drizzle that had been falling since dawn. The morning had started like any other. Tourists began arriving around 9 o'clock, forming orderly queues behind the velvet ropes. Marcus and his colleague James maintained their stoic positions, occasionally directing visitors toward the proper entrance or answering basic questions about tour times. The routine was familiar and comfortable. Everything changed when she arrived. The woman appeared to be in her 40s, wearing an expensive-looking cream-colored coat that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a month. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the weather, and she carried a designer handbag that she clutched tightly against her side. She approached the security checkpoint with the kind of confident stride that suggested she was used to getting her way. "Excuse me," she called out loudly, her voice cutting through the quiet morning air. "I need to speak to someone in charge immediately." Marcus maintained his position, but glanced toward the woman. Standard protocol required visitors to follow the established procedures, which meant joining the queue and waiting for the security staff to process them through the checkpoint. The woman, however, seemed to have different plans. "I said I need to speak to someone in charge," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "This is absolutely unacceptable." Sarah Mitchell, the head of visitor services, emerged from the security office. She was a patient woman in her 50s who had dealt with difficult visitors for over a decade. Her approach was always calm and professional, no matter how challenging the situation. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Sarah Mitchell, the visitor services manager. How can I help you today?" The woman's eyes narrowed as she looked Sarah up and down, apparently unimpressed by her simple uniform and friendly demeanor. "I'm Victoria Pemberton Hayes, and I demand to speak to the castle director immediately. This situation is completely inappropriate." Sarah maintained her professional smile. "I'd be happy to help you with whatever concern you have, Miss Pemberton Hayes. Could you tell me what specific issue you're experiencing?" Victoria gestured dramatically toward the queue of tourists who were now watching the unfolding drama with obvious interest. Several people had their phones out, though whether they were taking pictures of the castle or recording the confrontation wasn't immediately clear. "Look at this chaos," Victoria declared. "These people are standing around in the rain like animals. Where's the covered waiting area? Where are the refreshments? This is supposed to be a royal residence, not some common tourist trap." Marcus found himself listening despite his training to remain focused on his duties. In his 3 years at the castle, he had heard every possible complaint from visitors. Some were legitimate concerns about accessibility or facilities. Others were simply the result of people having unrealistic expectations about what a working royal residence could provide to thousands of daily visitors. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I understand your concern about the weather conditions. We do have covered areas available, and there are refreshment facilities inside the castle once you've completed the security screening. The queue system is designed to ensure everyone's safety and security while maintaining an orderly flow of visitors. Safety and security? Victoria's voice grew louder. What kind of security threat do you think I pose? Do I look like some kind of terrorist to you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus had seen this type of escalation before, usually from people who weren't accustomed to being treated the same as everyone else. The security protocols at royal residences weren't negotiable, regardless of someone's social status or personal opinion about their necessity. Ma'am, our security procedures apply to all visitors equally, Sarah explained patiently. It's not a matter of individual assessment, but rather a consistent policy that ensures everyone's safety, including yours. Victoria's face began to redden. This is ridiculous. I have connections. I know people in government. I shouldn't have to wait in line with tourists and commoners. Don't you know who I am? The phrase, "don't you know who I am," was something of a red flag for castle staff. In Marcus's experience, people who genuinely held important positions rarely felt the need to announce it so dramatically. Those who did often turned out to be far less important than they claimed. James, Marcus's fellow guard, caught his eye briefly. They had developed a system of subtle communication over their years of working together, and James's slight nod indicated he was also paying attention to the developing situation. Their primary responsibility was security, but they had learned to recognize when visitor services might need backup. I'm sure you're a very important person, Miss Pemberton Hayes, Sarah said diplomatically. However, our procedures are in place for everyone's protection, and we appreciate your understanding and cooperation. Understanding? Cooperation? Victoria's voice had now risen to a level that was clearly audible to everyone in the immediate area. I pay taxes that fund this entire operation. I'm essentially your employer, and I demand better treatment than this. Marcus suppressed a slight smile. The "I pay taxes" argument was another classic complaint he had heard countless times. While it was true that the royal estate received some public funding, the reality of how castle operations were financed was far more complex than most people understood. A small crowd of tourists had now gathered, no longer pretending to look at the castle architecture while listening to the argument. Several were openly recording the interaction with their smartphones. Marcus knew that within hours, clips of this confrontation could be circulating on social media platforms, potentially creating a public relations challenge for the castle management. Victoria seemed to notice the attention she was attracting, but rather than being embarrassed, she appeared to be energized by having an audience. This is exactly the kind of incompetence that's wrong with this country. No customer service, no respect for taxpayers, no understanding of basic courtesy. Sarah remained remarkably composed. I apologize if you feel our service hasn't met your expectations. If you'd like to proceed with your visit, I can expedite your processing through security. If you have specific complaints about our facilities or procedures, I can provide you with information about how to submit formal feedback to our management team. Expedite my processing. Victoria practically shrieked. I shouldn't need any processing at all. This is supposed to be a public building. I should be able to walk in and out as I please. This statement revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what Windsor Castle actually was. While parts of the castle were open to the public during certain hours, it remained a working royal residence and an active military installation. The security measures weren't arbitrary bureaucratic obstacles, but genuine necessities for protecting both the historical treasures housed within and the people who lived and worked there. Marcus noticed that several other tourists in the queue were beginning to show signs of impatience. One elderly gentleman kept checking his watch, and a family with young children looked increasingly uncomfortable with the loud argument taking place nearby. The situation was beginning to affect other visitors' experience, which was exactly the kind of disruption the castle staff worked hard to prevent. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her patience beginning to show slight signs of strain, "Windsor Castle is indeed a public attraction, but it's also a working royal residence with necessary security protocols. These procedures are in place for everyone's safety and are non-negotiable. Non-negotiable. Victoria seized on the word as if it were a personal insult. Everything is negotiable when you're dealing with reasonable people. The problem is that I'm clearly not dealing with reasonable people. At this point, Marcus made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of his morning. Breaking from his rigid ceremonial position, he took a step forward and cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in his clear, military-trained voice. "Perhaps I could help clarify the situation." Both Sarah and Victoria turned to look at him with surprise. Royal guards were typically expected to remain silent and motionless unless directly addressing a security threat. Marcus's intervention was unusual, but not unprecedented when visitor services needed support. Victoria looked him up and down with obvious disdain. "And who exactly are you supposed to be? Some kind of toy soldier in a costume?" The insult hit Marcus harder than he had expected. His red tunic and bearskin hat were indeed ceremonial, but they represented centuries of military tradition and personal sacrifice. He had earned his position through years of dedicated service in the British Army, including 2 tours in Afghanistan where he had seen friends wounded and killed in service to their country. "I'm Sergeant Marcus Thompson, ma'am. I'm a member of the Queen's Guard, responsible for the security of this facility and everyone in it, including yourself." Victoria laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Security? From tourists with cameras? How brave of you." Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly, but his military training helped him maintain his composure. "Security threats come in many forms, ma'am. Our job is to be prepared for all of them while ensuring that legitimate visitors can enjoy their experience safely." "Legitimate visitors?" Victoria's voice rose again. "Are you questioning my legitimacy? This is outrageous. I want to speak to your supervisor immediately." Sarah stepped back into the conversation. "Ms. Pemberton Hayes, Sergeant Thompson is trying to help resolve your concerns. If you could please lower your voice and work with us, I'm sure we can find a solution that addresses your needs." "Lower my voice." Victoria turned her attention back to Sarah with renewed fury. "I'll speak as loudly as I need to in order to get proper service. This is a public place, and I have every right to express my dissatisfaction with the incompetent treatment I'm receiving." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and Marcus could see that several people were now definitely recording the interaction. He also noticed that some of the tourists in the official queue were beginning to grumble about the delay. The situation was escalating beyond a simple customer service issue into something that could become a significant disruption to normal operations. Marcus decided to try a different approach. Drawing on his military experience dealing with civilian populations in conflict zones, he attempted to de-escalate by acknowledging Victoria's concerns while gently redirecting her toward a more constructive path. "Ma'am, I can see that you're frustrated with what you perceive as unnecessary delays and procedures. That's understandable. Many visitors feel that way initially. However, I can assure you that these measures exist for important reasons that go beyond what might be immediately obvious." Victoria studied his face for a moment, as if trying to decide whether his more respectful tone indicated that she was finally getting the deference she felt she deserved. "Well, at least someone here seems to have some sense. Yes, I am frustrated. I'm frustrated that I have to stand in the rain like a common tourist when I should be receiving VIP treatment. May I ask what kind of VIP treatment you were expecting?" Marcus asked carefully. "If there's been a miscommunication about the services available, perhaps we can clarify what options are actually offered." This question seemed to catch Victoria off guard. She had been operating under the assumption that her complaints would automatically result in special accommodations, but she hadn't actually specified what those accommodations should be. "Well, I expected to be able to enter without waiting in line. I expected covered areas and refreshments while waiting. I expected to be treated with the respect due to someone of my standing in the community." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. However, the castle's policies are designed to ensure fair treatment for all visitors. We don't have different entrance procedures based on social status. The security screening is mandatory for everyone, including government officials and members of nobility when they visit in unofficial capacities." "Government officials and nobility?" Victoria's eyes lit up with interest. "Well, that's different. I wasn't aware that such people had to follow these procedures too." Sarah saw an opening and stepped forward. Actually, we regularly host visits from members of parliament, local government officials, and even minor members of the royal family who come for personal tours. They all go through the same security procedures as any other visitor. It's a matter of consistent policy rather than personal discrimination. Victoria seemed to be processing this information, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. That may be your policy, but policies can be modified for special circumstances. I'm not just any random tourist off the street. Could you tell us more about your specific circumstances? Marcus asked. If there are accessibility needs or other considerations we should be aware of, we want to make sure we address them appropriately. This direct question seemed to fluster Victoria slightly. She had been operating on the assumption that her general importance would be self-evident, but she was being asked to provide specific justification for special treatment. I'm a prominent member of the local community, she said somewhat defensively. I serve on several charity boards, and my husband is involved in local government. We contribute significantly to various causes and organizations. Marcus and Sarah exchanged a brief glance. Community involvement and charitable work were certainly admirable, but they didn't constitute grounds for bypassing security protocols at a royal residence. However, attacking Victoria's community contributions would only escalate the situation further. That's wonderful that you're involved in community service, Sarah said diplomatically. However, our security procedures are based on facility requirements rather than individual community standing. I hope you can understand that we need to maintain consistency for operational and safety reasons. Victoria's face began to redden again. Operational and safety reasons? What exactly do you think is going to happen? Do you think I'm going to smuggle in weapons or steal the crown jewels? The mention of crown jewels caused several tourists to chuckle, which only seemed to increase Victoria's agitation. She wheeled around to face the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. This is what's wrong with this country, she announced to her impromptu audience. Bureaucratic nonsense and petty power games from people who have no understanding of how to treat their betters. The phrase "their betters" caused a noticeable shift in the crowd's mood. What had been amused observation began to turn into something more critical. Several people could be heard making negative comments about Victoria's attitude, though they were speaking quietly enough that their specific words weren't entirely clear. Marcus realized that the situation was approaching a tipping point. Victoria's behavior was alienating not just the castle staff, but also the other visitors, and her increasingly imperious attitude was generating exactly the kind of negative attention that could lead to more serious problems. "Ma'am," he said firmly but respectfully, "I think it might be best if we stepped aside to discuss your concerns privately. This public setting isn't ideal for resolving individual issues, and I'm sure you'd prefer to have a more personal conversation about your needs." Victoria looked at him suspiciously. "Stepped aside? Are you trying to silence me? I have every right to express my opinions publicly, especially when I'm being mistreated by public employees." "You absolutely have the right to express your opinions," Marcus agreed. "However, continuing this conversation in front of an audience isn't helping anyone reach a resolution. If we could speak privately, I might be able to provide you with information about alternative options that could address your concerns." The suggestion of alternative options seemed to intrigue Victoria. She glanced around at the crowd of tourists, many of whom were now openly staring at her with expressions ranging from amusement to disapproval. Perhaps she was beginning to realize that her public performance wasn't generating the sympathetic support she might have expected. "Alternative options?" she asked cautiously. "What kind of alternative options?" Marcus gestured toward a small office area near the entrance. "There are sometimes special circumstances that require individual consideration. However, these discussions need to happen in private to protect everyone's confidentiality and ensure we can have a productive conversation." Sarah looked at Marcus with surprise, but she trusted his judgment enough to support his approach. "That's correct. If there are special considerations that apply to your situation, we can certainly discuss them away from the crowd." Victoria seemed torn between her desire to continue her public demonstration of outrage and her curiosity about what these mysterious alternative options might be. After a moment of visible internal debate, her practical side won out over her theatrical impulses. "Fine," she said curtly. "But I expect this conversation to result in appropriate accommodations for my visit. As the three of them moved toward the office area, Marcus caught James's eye and nodded slightly. James would continue monitoring the main entrance while Marcus attempted to resolve the situation that had unexpectedly become his responsibility. He had no idea that his decision to intervene would lead to consequences that extended far beyond a simple customer service issue. The office they entered was small and practical, designed more for operational meetings than customer relations. Marcus offered Victoria a chair while Sarah remained standing near the door. The change of setting seemed to shift the dynamic of their interaction, creating a more intimate environment where Victoria's theatrical approach felt less appropriate. "Now then," Marcus said, settling into his professional military bearing, "let's discuss what specific accommodations might be possible within our operational constraints. But first, I need to understand exactly what you're hoping to achieve with your visit today." Victoria smoothed her expensive coat and sat up straighter in her chair. In the smaller, private setting, her demeanor became slightly less aggressive, though she maintained an air of expectation that suggested she still anticipated special treatment. "I'm planning a private event," she began, her voice now more controlled and businesslike. "A charity fundraiser for local veterans organizations. I wanted to tour the facilities to see if they might be suitable for hosting such an event." This revelation changed the entire context of the situation. Marcus felt a personal connection to anything involving veterans organizations, given his own military service and the challenges he had witnessed among former service members struggling to transition to civilian life. Sarah also seemed to react positively to the charitable purpose behind Victoria's visit. "That's a very worthy cause," Marcus said sincerely. "Veterans organizations certainly deserve community support. However, the public tour areas aren't typically available for private events. Castle facilities are usually reserved for official royal functions and specific ceremonial occasions." Victoria's expression tightened slightly. "I was told by someone in my social circle that arrangements could be made for significant charitable events, especially those supporting military causes. Perhaps my contact was mistaken about the possibilities." Sarah stepped forward. "There are occasionally special arrangements made for charitable functions, but they require formal applications through specific channels and approval at very high levels. It's not something that can be arranged through normal visitor services." "What kind of formal applications?" Victoria asked, her interest clearly piqued. "And what would the approval process involve?" Marcus realized he was venturing into territory that was beyond his normal expertise, but his military experience had taught him the importance of accurate information when dealing with expectations and planning. Such arrangements would require applications to the Master of the Household's office, significant advance notice, detailed security assessments, and approval from multiple levels of castle administration. "The Master of the Household." Victoria repeated the title with obvious interest. "That sounds like exactly the kind of person I should have been directed to speak with initially." Sarah shook her head gently. "The Master of the Household doesn't meet with individual visitors. Applications for special events go through a formal process that begins with written submissions and supporting documentation." Victoria's enthusiasm seemed to deflate slightly as the bureaucratic realities became clearer. "Written submissions? Supporting documentation? How long does such a process typically take?" "Several months at minimum," Marcus replied honestly. "Security assessments alone can take weeks, and scheduling depends on the royal family's calendar and existing commitments." The conversation continued as Victoria began to understand the complexity of what she had initially assumed would be a simple request. Her aggressive behavior at the entrance had been based on the misconception that she could simply arrive and arrange special access through force of personality and social connections.